Thank you for attending our Cures Foundation event. As you all know, Cures stands for a comprehensive understanding via research and education to schizophrenia. And we have two very, very special guests today that I hope you'll very much enjoy listening to. So we have Dr. Jacob Ballon, who is a full professor at Stanford and a schizophrenia renowned expert. And also Dr. Elizabeth Beam, who's at Stanford Healthcare as a resident. She holds a MD and a PhD, and she recently wrote an article for our Cures Foundation newsletter. So without any further ado, welcome Dr. Ballon and Dr. Beam.
Thank you so much for having us. I think we'll let Dr. Beam take it away, yeah?
Sounds good. Thank you so much for the invitation, Bethany. I'm really excited to speak to this group today. My talk is going to kind of go through my personal training journey from, first of all, an interest in the literary arts, and then pivoting toward understanding the neurobiology of mental illness and thinking about how we can improve treatments. My video has been glitching. I'm seeing that myself right now. So I'm going to turn it off for the talk, but can turn it back on for questions if it's working. So the title of this talk is Turning the Page and Treating Psychosis, or how poetry taught me what psychiatry needs and how that need might be met with a new wave of drug discovery. And so I'll go through sort of my own background in literary arts and the inspiration that I got from that in thinking about the human side of psychotic illness, go through a little bit of my training journey, and then pivot toward the future of drug discovery in psychiatry, focusing on new drugs with fundamentally different mechanisms for treating schizophrenia, which was the focus of that article that I co-wrote with Dr. Ballon for the newsletter. So first, a little bit about the background that got me inspired. And I'll start with a poem. This poem's called The Ambition Bird, and it reads, "So it has come to this, insomnia at 3:15 a.m., the clock tolling its engine like a frog following a sundial, yet having an electric seizure at the quarter hour. The business of words keeps me awake. I am drinking cocoa, the warm brown mama. I would like a simple life, yet all night I am laying poems away in a long box. It is my immortality box, my layaway plan, my coffin. All night dark wings flopping in my heart, each an ambition bird. The bird wants to be dropped from a high place like Tallahatchie Bridge. He wants to light a kitchen match and immolate himself. He wants to fly into the hand of Michelangelo and come out painted on a ceiling. He wants to pierce the hornet's nest and come out with a long godhead. He wants to take bread and wine and bring forth a man happily floating in the Caribbean. He wants to be pressed out like a key so he can unlock the magi. He wants to take leave among strangers, passing out bits of his heart like hors d'oeuvres. He wants to die changing his clothes and bolt for the sun like a diamond. He wants, I want, dear God, wouldn't it be good enough just to drink cocoa? I must get a new bird and a new immortality box. There is folly enough inside this one." And I like this poem because it gets at how ambition is something alluring, and it can even be dangerous because it is something that's difficult to have in a balanced way. And a little bit about this balance. One way to think about ambition or related concepts like motivation or energy or spontaneity is on a graph like this, where you can think of as ambition increases, as you would expect initially, your chances of success are going to increase up to this sort of happy place at the top here. But then if you have too much, you might even start to get disorganized, and there can be this trade-off. So if you don't have enough, as you might expect, your chances of success are low, but like I just mentioned, too much can leave you scattered, disarrayed, disorganized, not focused, and potentially achieving less success as a result. And this imbalance can occur in the case of mood disorders like bipolar disorder, which the author of that poem did suffer from. You might see too much ambition in a state of mania and too little in a state of depression. And the author of that poem was Anne Sexton, and for her, this imbalance of ambition did turn out, unfortunately, to be fatal in her case. Initially, poetry was something that she said led her by the hand out of madness. It offered this sort of fountain of ambition. And actually, it was her therapist who first encouraged her to write. She found writing therapeutic. Unfortunately, her treatment for bipolar disorder, she said, she joked that Thorazine, that antipsychotic she was on, is supposed to make the rhymer go away. She felt that taking her medication was incompatible with writing to the point that she would, quote, endure the consequent mania. And she did ultimately die by suicide. And it's thought that her bipolar disorder and her inadequate treatment for that is what precipitated her death. Now, I'd like to turn toward talking a little bit more about what can happen when ambition falls low. And in the case of schizophrenia, of psychotic illness, that's described as negative symptoms. And getting at the human side of this, I would like to show you a brief video by someone who speaks to his own experience of negative symptoms. See if this works.
Hi, I'm Randall, author of the blog Creative Schizophrenia on Healthy Place. I'm taking this video in front of a giant piece of cardboard because our renovation project is completely ripped up. I have a giant zit on my forehead, even though I'm almost 30 and I'm not supposed to get zits anymore. And I have a big scratch on my face from my 1-year-old son scratching me. Why am I starting a video this way? Well, I'm trying to be a little bit more unscripted, a little more spontaneous, and show a little more emotion, which ties into my topic for this video, which is negative symptoms of schizophrenia. It may come as a shock to you, but I used to do quite a bit of acting when I was in high school. I was lead role in a couple of musicals. I was no Robert Duvall or Tommy Lee Jones, reference to Lonesome Dove, my favorite movie, or Liam Hemsworth, who my wife wanted thrown in there because she thinks he's hot. But I was a pretty good actor and had good emotional range. But since I began exhibiting symptoms of schizophrenia, it's been very difficult to show emotion and to feel emotion. Now, the feeling emotion part is something that I talk more about in my post, but showing emotion was not something I realized that I had such an issue with until my wife pointed out to me that she noticed that I was smiling a lot less, laughing a lot less, more of monotone expression in my voice, just basically showing less emotion. And so showing emotion and being spontaneous is something that I really have to work at if I want to be more like that. Now, in terms of feeling more emotion, which is probably the bigger issue with negative symptoms of schizophrenia, it's really an uphill battle. I don't feel much joy in things that used to bring me a lot of joy, even when I'm not feeling depressed. I avoid spending time with others. I avoid spontaneous activities. I don't talk as much as I used to, especially when I'm not feeling well. And it's really hard. It's hard to live life when you essentially don't feel like you're getting anything out of life. And so my message to those of you who may be experiencing the same or similar symptoms is to find those reasons that you are living and focus on those reasons and focus on the feelings that you have for them. Like for me, it's my children and my wife and the love that I have for them. And I'm working to focus on that and focus on what I used to feel and what my love for them should elicit. And that's great joy. And I'm just really trying to get back into my life and overcome those negative symptoms. So that's my message for you guys. Hang in there.
So what I think Randall speaks really eloquently to is the the deep human impact that, in particular, these negative symptoms of schizophrenia can have on a person. And the unfortunate reality that first generation of antipsychotic medications doesn't do a great job of treating those symptoms. So altogether, what this sort of early start in the literary arts taught me about what psychiatry need is thinking about how mental illness, it can make a person's reasons for living appear out of reach or not worth reaching. And so I got started with this question, how can we help bring those reasons back into reach? How can we help nurture a person's ambition? How can we help them along in their relationships, their function at school, at work, the things that tend to matter most to people? Beyond just treating hallucinations that we are so familiar with in the diagnostic criteria. So are there ways that we can facilitate this kind of healing pharmacologically, and how can we do that better than Thorazine did for Anne Sexton? So a little bit about my background in psychiatry. I started out, grew up in Ohio, was very inspired by reading, poetry, became intrigued by neuroscience. When I went off and pursued undergraduate studies at Duke, I pursued a double major in English as well as neuroscience. It was the first year that neuroscience was a major at the university, and wrote theses in both. Then went off for 2 years and did research primarily in neuroimaging at Harvard, looking at the circuitry of cognitive symptoms in individuals with early signs of depression. And then ultimately matriculated at Stanford Medical School with this interest in research that led me to apply while I was in medical school to do a PhD in neuroscience. And I'll speak a little bit about my research. And then ultimately was able to match into the residency program here and stay, and it's on the research track. So we'll have some dedicated time to do research going forward. And I do hope that it involves the topics that I've become interested in treating the negative symptoms and thinking about new cognitive models for schizophrenia. So a little bit about my thesis research. The goal was to synthesize knowledge across the field of human neuroimaging. This was the major paper that I had published as a result of that research, mapping a data-driven framework representing domains of knowledge of human neurobiology. And this research, it synthesized 18,155 articles. These were studies of human brain function where coordinates in the brain, actual data, were able to be scraped out of the article. As part of that research, I created models for both basic domains of brain function as well as domains of mental illness. And then to kind of see how well these domains are representing knowledge, how valid they are, trained models to use those coordinate data to predict words for domains like the domain of psychotic illness. And so these were machine learning models that were trained in 70% of articles, tuned in 20%, and then ultimately tested on 10% that were withheld from training. And so, I'll say one sub-conclusion of that research was that our knowledge of psychosis, and in particular the circuitry of psychosis as we're measuring it with neuroimaging, it's particularly limited. So here are some terms for psychotic illness that we were scraping out of the full texts. This is the circuit that is mapped when we look at relationships between those full text terms and the coordinate data in articles. And this circuit is actually primarily a frontal lobe circuit. As I'll get into, the classic textbook idea of the circuitry for schizophrenia. It does involve some deeper brain regions as well. But when we look with neuroimaging, it's these frontal regions that get mapped. And interestingly, when I look at the performance of those models where we use coordinate data to predict terms for psychosis as well as other kinds of mental illness, psychotic illness is the only one where the terms could not be predicted better than chance. So we have a ways to go in validating our brain disease relationships, in particular for psychotic illness. And now I'll pivot toward looking ahead at the new wave of drug discovery, particularly for negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And first, I'll just review that textbook circuit model for schizophrenia. The idea is that the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, meaning hallucinations, delusions, those are mediated by a mesolimbic pathway. Meso meaning starting in the midbrain, this ventral tegmental area, and projecting to ventromedial prefrontal cortex, nucleus accumbens, areas involved in emotional processing. So there's essentially too much activity through this pathway. And then the negative symptoms of schizophrenia are mediated by a mesocortical pathway originating in a similar spot deep in the midbrain and projecting out through the prefrontal cortex. And I'll also go in a little bit more detail into exactly what we mean by negative symptoms, at least how they're defined in our textbook in the field of psychiatry, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM. So avolition, that's a decrease in motivated self-initiated purposeful activities, and that sort of low ambition state that I was describing earlier. Flat affect, so diminished emotional expression in the face, eye contact, prosody or your rhythm of speech, and movements that give emotional emphasis to speech. Alogia, or diminished language, diminished speech output. Anhedonia, the decreased ability to experience pleasure from positive stimuli, happy things, or a degradation in the recollection of pleasure that was previously experienced. So inability to kind of have joy when you're remembering things, happy times. And then asociality, the lack of interest that can happen in for social interactions. And I'll also speak a little bit to the impact that negative symptoms can have. Negative symptoms are present in over half of individuals with a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. And unfortunately, they respond to treatment in roughly a quarter of those treated, in the standard way with a psychiatrist out in the community. And there are several studies which do demonstrate by various measures that it's these negative symptoms that more strongly impact function than the positive ones. And now a little bit on the history of the medications that we use to treat schizophrenia. So Thorazine, that medication that Anne Sexton was on, that was the first antipsychotic. It was synthesized in 1951, and it wasn't intended to treat mental illness. It was intended as an adjunct for general anesthesia because of its cooling properties. It was actually thought to physically cool the body, but its usefulness in treating psychosis was discovered, and ultimately Thorazine was sort of rebranded as an antipsychotic. And then for the next 20 years, about 40 new antipsychotics acting in similar ways to Thorazine, but with perhaps fewer side effects, were introduced around the world. And then after a gap in drug discovery, around 1990, there was another wave of drug development when atypical antipsychotics were developed, similarly acting on dopamine as the typicals, but with fewer motor side effects and a thought that these might improve negative symptoms. So in terms of how these are acting, the typicals tend to decrease dopamine more potently in the mesolimbic pathway than the atypicals do. But it's not really clear how they're working within the mesocortical pathway. It's not really clear that they are actually doing much for the negative symptoms. And taking a pharmacological view of this, the typical antipsychotics, they're potent D2 blockers, and they might have activity at a couple of other receptors, but really their main action is at the D2 receptors. Atypical antipsychotics are much dirtier drugs. They are less potent D2 antagonists, and they have more activity at receptors like serotonin receptors or 5-HT receptors. And then getting at how these new atypical antipsychotics are working for treating negative symptoms, there are sort of limited gains. So here's just one study that was done in 34 individuals treated with a placebo, 70 treated with the atypical antipsychotic olanzapine, and really there was no difference there. And then here, when we do compare directly a typical with an atypical, maybe there is a bit of a benefit with that atypical, but it's a confusing result to interpret if when we look at the atypical against placebo, we aren't seeing as much benefit. So now let's turn to this next wave of drug discovery for schizophrenia. I'll talk about 3 different kinds of drugs which work by targeting the negative and perhaps as well as the positive symptoms. So first, there's another set of atypical antipsychotics, and these are out on the market. Next in development are muscarinic, M1 and M4 receptor agonists. And then finally, there's a lot of excitement around these trace amine receptor 1 or TAR1 modulators. So first, the new atypical antipsychotics. So by comparison to these classical atypicals, the new atypical antipsychotics work in a way that's yet even more complicated, essentially. They have partial, in the case of brexpiprazole in particular, they have partial agonism at D2, and then they're also partial agonists at the serotonin 5-HT1A receptor. And it's, at that receptor that at least brexpiprazole is thought to have antidepressant properties. And then when it comes to the muscarinic agonists, so muscarinic agents, you're all probably familiar with Benadryl and the sort of hangover that you can get if you take Benadryl to help you sleep. The next morning you might feel foggy, sort of cognitively slowed down. Well, the idea with these drugs is that maybe if we increase the activity of the muscarinic system in the brain, we can actually enhance cognition. And M4 and M1 receptors are thought to be expressed throughout areas overlapping with the mesocortical pathway. And so xanomeline, that's a drug that agonizes these receptors. Now, the problem is that if you increase cholinergic activity, not just in the brain, but in the entire body, you get a lot of side effects. And those side effects can be things like nausea, constipation, dry mouth, blurry vision. So when this drug was first used in humans, it was paired with trospium, which blocks muscarinic receptors in the body with the idea being to prevent all these side effects. Now this is all still in development, and here's some results that were published in the New England Journal of Medicine showing that there is this greater improvement in the PANSS, the positive and negative symptom scale score, when individuals got this muscarinic agonist instead of placebo. but there were more adverse events with the constipation, nausea, etc. So still working out the exact sort of balance that's going to be needed for this to be, an option that we really want to turn to in the market, but it's quite promising. And then finally, I'll talk about the TAR1 modulators. And so a couple of these that are in development include ulatorant, which is TAR1 agonist and also acts at 5-HT1A. And then ralmitarant, which is a partial agonist at TAR1. And the idea is that these can impact positive symptoms, can treat those by decreasing dopamine signaling in the mesolimbic pathway, and can also, in addition to that, target negative symptoms by increasing glutamate signaling in the mesocortical pathway. So the idea is that it could be one medication to treat really the continuum of symptoms. And here's some data in support of them. So these are animal studies. One way of testing in animals sort of motivation and willingness to persist is with a forced swim test. This is in a rodent model. We see in particular that with partial TAR1 agonists, animals are less immobile. They're staying still for a shorter period of time in this test. And then here's data from an object retrieval task, a test of cognitive functioning, and in particular with the partial TAR1 agonist that was tested here, there's an improvement in accuracy on this task. And then finally, I'll also touch on this idea that maybe it would be helpful if we reconceptualized negative symptoms and thought about them in a more refined way. So in the case of depression, there's been a lot of thought around more refined circuit models. For example, breaking depression down into a symptom of anhedonia, where there is reduced pleasure in response to things that once were sources of joy, versus cognitive dyscontrol, ability to sort of rein in your attention and focus on complex tasks, each of which is thought to be mapped to a different circuit in the brain. And the idea is that this could then guide selection of drugs that already exist and are thought to act on these pathways. So for example, individuals with anhedonia who have decreased dopamine signaling, they might respond well to pramipexole. Individuals who have more of a cognitive dyscontrol subtype underlying their depression, they might benefit more from guanfacine acting on alpha-2 receptors in this circuit. So that's another sort of idea on the horizon that may come to fruition in drug discovery for schizophrenia as well. And then also, again, getting at the psychosocial, the human side of all of this, solutions beyond drugs are going to be important too. So some evidence-based psychosocial approaches for managing negative symptoms include things like cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis, illness self-management training, family psychoeducation, social skills training, supported employment, and assertive community treatment. So there are plenty of other solutions out there beyond what you can find in a pill box. So that's really all that I had to go through today. And with that, I'm happy to transition to questions and to hear what Dr. Ballon might be interested in adding to the conversation.
Well, I'm going to start out. That was great, Dr. Beam. Thanks for running us through that. I think it'd be great for us to talk a bit more about some of those medicines, but before we do that, there are some fabulous questions in the chat that I've been monitoring, and so I'm going to throw some of them your way, and I'll be happy to address some of them as well. I'm just going to scroll up for a minute, but I think this may be a better question in some ways for you than for me, which is Chelsea asks, and Chelsea, if you want to unmute and ask it, you're welcome to do that, or I can read your question. But Chelsea wants to know about how we keep track of neurotransmitters in the brain, and how do we know that medications that we say affect certain neurotransmitters actually do that. And wouldn't it be great if there was a way to actually kind of real time see what the effects of these medicines are on neurotransmitters, and then we could actually adjust based on something objective like that, as opposed to kind of, frankly, how we often have to do it based on what we observe in people's behavior.
Oh, that is such a good question. And I think it really speaks to the disconnect between the two types of models that I was showing up on the screen. You know, we have circuit models that we've developed with neuroimaging, tools like magnetic resonance imaging, which don't show us at all what kinds of receptors, what kinds of chemicals are active in the brain, just where neurons are active, purely localization based. And then it's in animal models, really, where we're able to knock out specific receptors and specific cells that we're able to look at, you know, those specific receptors. The kind of imaging where we can combine the two into a single experiment would be PET imaging, positron emission tomography, where you can label specific kinds of chemicals and look at where they are active in the brain. But the issue is that there is radiation exposure involved. So those studies tend to be really small. They don't scale as well as standard magnetic resonance imaging does. It would be great if we could figure out a way to scale it to do that safely, of course.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So I mentioned earlier that I have a master's degree in biomedical engineering, specifically neural engineering. So I actually did some research using electrocorticography, but you know, I got really sick with schizophrenia in grad school, so I wasn't able to finish, but I got my master's. But at one point, I created this device that would use like ultra-weak photon emission, using biophotonics and stuff like that, that would not have those radiation effects. And I was like, when I was in a state mental institution, I thought I was working for the government, and I kept talking to them about my ideas of having like a head, like a I guess hat, like the one I'm wearing, and you would be able to, you know, in real time, watch how the different neurotransmitters throughout the brain, and like effectively give people the exact amount of medications that they needed. So I was just wondering, like, how you guys would do it, but
Well,
yeah, I thought that was a very interesting thing. It made me remember what I was thinking about.
well, I know that's sounds like you were doing really fascinating work. I think there's a couple things that I would keep in mind, though. So it is right now, you know, very difficult to monitor these kinds of things in real time, but to the extent that these kinds of experiments have been carried out, let's say in animals where you can give a medicine and you can track a little bit more reasonably real-time changes in neurotransmitters, we often, for many of the psychiatric medications, will see that neurotransmitter changes and changes in symptoms or functioning happen at different timescales. And so it can be that actually, like antidepressants, for example, often, you know, may take several weeks to work for folks, but actually the neurotransmitter changes that they make happen much more rapidly than that. So I think neurotransmitters are really interesting. I think they're really important, but I don't think that they give us the full story as to what happens. I also would just say that human behavior is much more complex than a series of neurotransmitter mediated reactions. And so I think that they are helpful for us to understand medicines. They also can be helpful in helping us predict very likely side effects that we might expect from certain medicines, but they don't really paint the whole picture, both in terms of how medications work or in terms of how people work as far as getting changes. And so Dr. Beam, you know, showed that slide at the end of all of the other non-medication treatments that, you know, there's continuing work being done at our institution and elsewhere on how to help with that. And I think maybe it was you, Chelsea. Somebody had mentioned that meds and therapy together really work well, and it's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to keep that in mind and to remember that human behavior is very complex, and people get into patterns. And if you're in a pattern for a long time, even a medication that can fix whatever might have caused one to be in that pattern doesn't change that pattern for a person right away. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind. So I agree that I think that before the end of my career, we will have a better way of predicting what medicine for a person and maybe at what dose in some ways. But I don't know that the answer is going to be because we know exactly what their neurotransmitters are doing. That'd be my thought. Are you going to move to? Yeah, of course. No, that was a great question. The provocative question, and one that a lot of people we could spend a lot of time debating, and I'm sure that there are others who would give this talk who would answer that question differently than I. But that's my feeling on things. I want to get to Nadia's question because it's also a fundamental and important question, which is, what do all these complex medications do to the rest of the body? How do they affect the heart, stomach, kidneys, and liver? And I'll take the first stab at this one, and then I'll let Dr. Beam jump in as well. Imagine you have shoulder pain. You know, you were doing whatever, you were working on the yard, and you got shoulder pain, and you take some Tylenol or some Motrin to help with that shoulder pain, and magically the shoulder pain gets better. It would seem like the medicine is just going to your shoulder, right? But we know when you swallow a pill, it's going to go throughout your whole body. The same thing is, of course, true with antipsychotics or with antidepressants or any psychiatric medication. Even if we decide that what they're doing is only targeted on things that happen in the brain, we know that there are dopamine receptors and serotonin receptors and histamine receptors and all these neurotransmitter receptors located in various other parts of the body. There are more serotonin receptors, for example, in the gut than in the brain. In the pancreas, there are dopamine receptors. The pancreas is in many ways almost like a mini brain. There are receptors for almost all of these neurotransmitters in the pancreas. And when I say that it helps predict what you might expect from side effects to know about receptors, that become more predictable because there are dopamine receptors in the pancreas that impact insulin and blood sugar in a way that makes it more predictable that antipsychotics might impact blood sugar. And so we know that, and imagine everybody probably on this call has to some extent or another experienced or loved somebody who's experienced the side effects of a medication that has caused either weight gain or blood sugar problems like diabetes, could be liver problems, kidney problems, there are all kinds of things that can happen. And so the newer drugs are intended to not cause as many of those problems. I am hopeful, I'm optimistic that in some way may be the case, right? That, we're sort of trying, as people are developing new drugs, we're, always trying to develop ones that are going to be safer and easier to tolerate. And they're not really going to be successful in the market if they aren't, right? No one's going to want to prescribe a drug that doesn't really improve on what we already have. So it makes it harder for the companies to come up with new medicines because the bar always rises. But the fact is that many of these drugs are still relatively new. We probably don't know all that there is to know about their safety. That isn't to say that they're not safe. They're rigorously tested, the ones that make it to the market. By all means, they are safe enough for me to feel comfortable prescribing. But there's also a question about TAR1 drugs and NMS. There's not really been reports of NMS with TAR1 drugs. There's reasons to believe that they would be pretty safe and unlikely to cause NMS. But, only several thousand people have taken them so far, as opposed to, tens of thousands or 1 million people, where you might see more rare potential side effects. So it's important for me as a psychiatrist to always be thinking about the people I'm working with and their whole body and their whole physical health as well as their mental health. And then I don't want to be using a medication that puts a person's physical health in greater jeopardy. Sometimes we have to balance. If a medicine is what really, really helps a person stay safe and stable, that sometimes there's trade-offs we have to make, and we have to figure out how to do that. But it's my hope that many of these newer medicines, in particular the TAR1 drugs, seem to be very reasonable. In fact, there's some evidence that they may in fact help blood sugar, and may even be potential treatments down the line for diabetes by themselves potentially. So there's some room for optimism that the drugs that are coming out will be better tolerated than what's already out there for folks. And because the metabolic side effects, weight gain and blood sugar problems are so prominent and so known, it's a big focus for the companies. And of course, we'll see, and hopefully we won't find different things. The muscarinic drugs like the CAR-XT and the one emraclidine that are sort of still in development. CAR-XT probably going to make it to market, I would imagine, by the end of this year or sometime next year. You know, almost didn't make it because of side effects related to acetylcholine. Those are things like can cause upset stomach, diarrhea. It can be very intolerable. The idea that with the CAR-XT, with the xanomeline that they added, the trospium helps to block some of those muscarinic side effects, and maybe will make that drug worthwhile. It sounds like in research studies so far that's been the case. It's frankly, as I see it scientifically, a very elegant design. And I hope that it works out that way. I'm looking forward to being able to offer that medicine to patients if and when it becomes available on the market. So really important to be thinking about how medications impact the whole body, because of course people are whole people. And so, you know, we don't want to reduce things down to things that are overly narrowly focused or myopic, and be thinking about the big picture.
Dr. Ballon, would you like to speak on supplements and diet at this point?
Supplements and diet. Well, I'm happy to. Yeah, I'm happy to. So there's no question that that diet is important, right? That's an easy statement to make. You know, I have worked with a number of people who have tried a number of different diets in an effort to help with their mental health. I find that rigid diets are hard for people to maintain for long enough to achieve a notable benefit. And so I don't typically work with people on things like keto diet, low FODMAP diet. People have come to me with all different kinds of restrictive diets. Now, there are occasions where there's a particular reason why that might be the case, particularly when it comes to being gluten-free. There are some specific circumstances where that can be important. And you know, I would encourage folks to look at the work of Deanna Kelly from University of Maryland, where she does a lot of really interesting work understanding why for some people with schizophrenia, gluten actually can be important for them to stay away from. In a small subset of people, she does really elegant research on that. So I think in general, I want people to maintain the kind of standard heart healthy diet that I would recommend for anybody, which is also, I should say, people with mental illness, you know, historically have a lower life expectancy. And I think that's for a variety of reasons. But I think that one of the things that's important to remember is that the leading cause of death is usually heart disease, and no different than other folks in the community, with an increased incidence of cigarette smoking being part of that. And that again is that could be the subject of a whole other lecture as to why the rates of smoking are so high in people with mental illness, and how tobacco companies play a role in how we got to that is an interesting aside. But it means that you know, a regular heart healthy diet is as important or more important in people with mental illness than anybody else, which is lean proteins, whole grains, leafy green vegetables, the things that, you know, you think of as being healthy. And that of course everybody is going to have, you know, days where they focus on that diet and days where they lose focus from that diet, and that's okay. And of course exercise also being an important component. And so I talk with people at every clinical visit about the importance of exercise and trying to make sure that people are getting at least 30 to 60 minutes of exercise, hopefully at least 5 times a week. So all these things play a major role, both in terms of helping your mental health and your physical health.
Let's see, we have some other questions. Someone asked about weight gain. Do these antipsychotics actually increase your appetite? And on a similar note, are the metabolic side effects ever permanent? Not the weight itself, but the hunger, for example.
Let's see. So, Dr. Beam, do you want to take that one, or you want me to take that one?
I think this is really an area of expertise of yours, so I'll defer to you.
So, weight gain is really tricky. If it was easy to lose weight, I think many of us on this call, myself included, would probably, maybe look a little different. So it's really hard to lose weight once you gain it. That being said, there are certain things that that are caused by the medication that can be changed, that tend to revert back. So I've seen many people who've gained a lot of weight on certain antipsychotics, olanzapine in particular, where they will switch the medicine to something else that's less risky for weight gain, and they will lose some portion of that weight. It's hard to lose all of it, but they will lose some portion. In fact, some medications came out and we initially thought that they were actually weight loss agents, but really what it was that people were switching from high risk for weight gain medicines and weight gain causing medicines to things that were causing less weight gain, and therefore they lost weight, but it wasn't that the medicine was actually a weight loss agent otherwise. There are, however, some new medicines that are out that are being tested for weight for antipsychotic induced weight gain. So things that are already on the market that I have been working with a few of my other physician colleagues to prescribe, and you can ask about. They're very expensive, but you may have seen these advertised. Are the GLP-1 agonists is the category, and Ozempic, I think, is the one. Semaglutide is the generic name. I will say this: I've had a couple of physicians who have reached out to me and said, I don't feel comfortable prescribing these medicines for antipsychotic weight gain. I'm concerned that I've seen things that would indicate risks for depression. My response to that is that there are some clinical trials that have demonstrated safety and efficacy in people with schizophrenia and antipsychotic induced weight gain. And so I push them to overcome those fears and consider prescribing it for these folks who I thought it was worth prescribing it for. So just good to have that in mind, that there can sometimes be some resistance in the community. So hopefully it's not permanent, but it is very hard to lose weight once you gain it. The body can change metabolism based on on weight, and so that can be hard to overcome.
Would you like to speak about family psychoeducation?
Sure. I'd be happy to. It's very important, I think, that that families can be on the same page about certain aspects of treatment, right? I think that it is important for everybody to have a basic set of understanding as to what the range of treatments are that are out there, to have a shared sense of what it is that treatment is intended to accomplish. Why would a person go to treatment? And that means both, people who are the identified patient as well as the family. I really like Dr. Amador's LEAP model, right? Which is that the importance of finding areas of agreement in order to be able to move forward. That doesn't mean, and I tell this to my patients all the time and to family members, we're not always going to agree on the tactics, right? There's going to be times where I'm going to suggest a medicine or I'm going to suggest something, and we might disagree about that and we can talk about it. But it's so important that we at least can share where it is that we're going together. Why are we even in the room together? What are we trying to accomplish? And so psychoeducation can be helpful for that. I would also, put a plug in for some work being done at University of Washington that we've been part of around family psychoeducation, and training training certain family members to be essentially ambassadors. Not dissimilar in some ways from the NAMI family to family program that's existed for a number of years, but maybe with a slightly different tack, a slightly different focus. But I think it's so important to have family members involved in the care. I mean, I think anything that involves one member of a family affects the whole family, and so it's really vital that we can have a sort of shared language in which we can communicate about what we see, what we're worried about, and where we're headed. And so psychoeducation is certainly one way to get towards that.
Okay, it looks like we have a question about omega-3 in fish oils for heart health. Would you like to take that one?
You want me to do that? Or you want to take that one, Dr. Beam? I'll jump in if you like.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so omega-3 fish oils. So there's fish oil. There's two different kinds of fish oils, and this pushes just a little bit outside of my general area, but I will do my best here, which is to say, there have and I'm thinking at this point, by the way, Bethany, that you need my colleague Dr. Nordzi to come on, because he is an expert in lifestyle medicine, and he will talk about for an hour about exercise, diet, supplements, and fish oil. So I'm putting
I'd
that
like
on
to connect with him. That sounds great.
I'm putting that on your agenda right now.
Thank
But
you.
there are two main kinds of fish oils. There's sort of the fish oil made by salmon, and then there's fish oil by what they call like cold water fish, which are usually like herring and mackerel. And there's some similarities. They're pretty similar, but there's some slight differences in the kind of chemical structure. And it's the cold water fish, the herring and the mackerel, that have shown to be a little bit more helpful overall with people who are at risk for psychosis. And in general, those are the fish oils that I recommend for folks. Now, I don't see much downside to fish oil of any kind. So I've always told people, there are some supplements out there where there are some obvious risks. There are some supplements where the only risk is to your wallet, and that like they may not be risky, but they may not do anything. And so you're going to pay for something that's no more effective than the air we are breathing. And then there's some supplements where we have some evidence that they may actually be helpful. And fish oils seem to be in that last category, where they may actually be helpful as anti-inflammatory, antioxidants, and be worthwhile. So I don't have any problem with people taking fish oils. I think we can, moderate our expectations, but certainly they're not unreasonable.
Can you look at clinicaltrials.gov to see active research on these medications and others?
Yes, clinicaltrials.gov. If you were, first of all, I will put a pitch in for participating in clinical trials. We do a number of them here. There is evidence that people who participate in clinical trials overall do better than people who don't. Now, that's not to say that there isn't risk involved in being in a clinical trial, because of course there is. And clinical trials are not designed for any individual benefit. They're for the benefit of, bringing new medicines to the market or understanding other science. But people who participate in clinical trials, they tend to, they come to see the doctor more frequently. They can, they get to take a little bit more ownership over what it is that they're, what they're doing. They pay more attention overall to kind of what their experience is, and then in essence learn a lot more about like how their body responds to things. And so, and every medicine that comes to market has to be tested in people. It starts out in phase 1, where they do first in human, where they just are, first they test it in animals, and then they give it to the first in human, where they just are testing at very high doses to see is it safe in the short term. And then they, after that, they start to say, well, let's try it in what's called phase 2, where they're figuring out like, okay, do we think there's a reasonable chance that this is going to work? And if so, what is the range of doses, or what are a couple of doses we think might work? And those are really important studies, because those set the ground for what are called phase 3 studies, which are the final and the larger clinical trials. Those are the ones that you have to have 2 separate phase 3 studies that show a benefit before the FDA will approve a medicine. And phase 3 studies also have to include a certain portion of time where they follow for safety. So you can't just show a benefit in 6 weeks and put a drug on the market. You have to follow it longer term to see what the safety is. These studies are usually what are called blinded, so you don't necessarily know if you're on the study medicine or a placebo, and neither does the doctor doesn't know. But of course, if there's ever emergencies, it can be discovered. But I would encourage everyone to take a look at clinicaltrials.gov. If you live near Stanford, of course, we'd be happy to have you reach out, whether you're my patient or not, whether we take your insurance or not. You can be part of clinical trials potentially. And it's just it can be a really nice thing to do to give back to your community, as well as to maybe try something that other people haven't had access to. You know, you might get the new latest greatest, and that might be really important to know, especially as a drug might make its way to market.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left of your time. We have another question that came in. I have had my son genetically tested to see which drugs metabolize well. If a drug is classified as a fast metabolizer, would you stay away from that drug?
So I will say this, that question, first of all, gets at genetic testing for medications, which, except for what the question asker was mentioning around metabolism, almost all of those results are unhelpful. So I would encourage you not to pursue pharmacogenetic testing. You would think we would be in a place now where you could do that kind of test and get the answers that these companies would like you to think that you are getting. But when people come to me with those, I don't know what to do with it, because almost all of the research that most of the tests that they offer are based on have been discredited in larger studies. So with that as an aside, if a person were to be a high, an ultra high metabolizer, I may or may not decide we're not going to use that medicine, but I am probably going to decide that we'll try it at a higher dose. And similarly, if a person is an ultra low metabolizer, I may or may not decide not to use that medicine, but we would try it at a lower dose because that drug might accumulate. And because that can make things a little bit more complicated, unless I had a real reason that I felt like we absolutely had to stay on that medicine, I'd probably move on to something that was a little bit more down the middle. But yeah, but other than understanding the likelihood of metabolism, there's really not much other value to the pharmacogenetic testing.
Somebody asks if these new antipsychotics can be used adjunctively with, I believe, with atypicals. Would CAR-XT, the TAR1 medications, could they be used adjunctively, or is that not known?
So that's my hope, actually, right? So first, there has been, before the pandemic, I went to a meeting and saw some initial data on ulotaront, which is one of the TAR1 drugs, and they use, I can't quote the study perfectly at this point because it's been a few years since I saw it presented, but they showed really nice data that showed that people who took clozapine and ulotaront did better than either group by itself, which is what we're looking for an adjunctive medicine, that it really shows that kind of additive or even synergistic kind of benefit. And there's reason to believe that these drugs may be able to provide that. We take Tylenol. I talked about shoulder pain before. You have shoulder pain, you can take Tylenol and you can take Advil. And they're both pain medicines, but they both work slightly differently. And it turns out that if you take both, if you have really significant pain, you might take both and you actually will have better pain relief than either by itself. And that's my hope with these newer medicines that have the different mechanisms, that adding a muscarinic drug to a drug that primarily works on dopamine, even if I'm not such a believer in the detail of the neurotransmitters, gives me reason to believe that these two drugs may work differently enough, though, that they may provide unique benefit. And I would also suggest that there are probably people walking around who haven't benefited from the medicines we have currently, all of which, to some extent or another, focus on dopamine, and may benefit from these newer drugs because they didn't have a dopamine problem the way that we might have thought they did. So, again, we can't characterize people to that level of detail yet to be able to really make that discernment, make that decision. But I'm hopeful that there will be some people who will suddenly get better than we expected taking some of these newer drugs, because actually the drug more appropriately caught what it is that they sort of needed from a medicine. But we'll see.
I was wondering if we wanted to end by asking Dr. Beam to share a little bit more about her research and future goals. That question has come in. I see you answered part of it, but would you like to share a little bit more with us?
Yeah, so, big picture, I would say my goal is to kind of rethink the way that we define mental illness, because for so long, since the DSM first came out, it's been by expert opinion. And I think we could come up with models of disease that better guide our drug discovery efforts if they were biologically based at the outset. So I hope to continue in working on data-driven approaches to thinking about models of sort of subsets of negative symptoms like anhedonia or cognitive dyscontrol, and to take approaches that kind of combine analysis of texts with analysis of biological data.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beam, and thank you, Dr. Ballon. We've learned so much tonight and genuinely enjoyed having you. So, well, thank you all for coming to this lecture. I believe the recording will be available in a few days, and we hope you'll come to our next one. So, good night.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you
Thank
again.
you.